The train from York pulled into Euston under a sullen sky, its whistle dissolving into the winter fog that clung to the platforms like damp wool. It was the sort of evening when faces blurred and time stretched, and yet, for all the anonymity London promised, one young woman was expected to emerge from that mist and did not. Miss Eleanor Vane, 23, educated, of good family, had boarded the 3:15 express in York with a small leather valise and a letter of introduction to Lady Charlotte Manvers. The housemaid at Charlotte's Mayfair residence swore the note had arrived that morning, written in Eleanor's neat hand. "I shall be with you by 6. But 6 o'clock passed, then 7, and at 8 the butler rang the station. Yes, the York express had arrived. Yes, all passengers had disembarked. Beyond that, no one could say. The police took the matter soberly enough when Lady Charlotte pressed them. Young women do vanish in London, but rarely those of Eleanor Vane's stamp. Inspector Crisp of the Yard, a small and methodical man whose eyes missed little, began by tracing the obvious threads. Miss Vane had purchased a second-class ticket at York. The clerk remembered her because she asked, twice, the time of arrival, almost anxious, "Sir," like she feared missing something. Several fellow passengers confirmed her presence in the compartment. A quiet girl in a dove-gray traveling coat, a book unopened on her lap. At Darlington she was seen gazing out the window, pale, abstracted, and then nothing. Not a porter recalled lifting her bag. No cabman remembered her face. It was as if, in the stretch between the last tunnel and Euston's roar, Eleanor Vane had stepped out of the world. On the third day, the newspapers ran it, mysterious disappearance of a Yorkshire heiress. The word heiress was an exaggeration, but sensation thrives on the thinnest pretext. Crisp disliked sensation. He disliked, even more, the curious scrap that turned up the same afternoon. In the station's lost property office, a single railway luggage label, damp and curling, bearing in Eleanor's handwriting her own name and the address of Lady Charlotte. Except the handwriting wavered strangely, the last letters cramped, as if written in haste or fear. And on the back, in pencil, a word that made no sense, Wednesday. Nothing more. Odd thing, said Crisp to his sergeant, holding the label to the light of his desk lamp. The girl wrote this after she left York. New pencil marks over the original ink. And yet why put Wednesday? She vanishes on Monday. Was it a meeting? A warning? Or, he turned the slip between thumb and forefinger. Was it meant? For us, that night, a new witness appeared. The ticket collector from Carstairs Junction, miles north of London. Yes, he'd checked tickets after Darlington. Yes, the young lady in grey had hers ready. But here he frowned. She wasn't alone then. A gentleman joined her, came aboard at Northallerton. Tall chap, dark coat, soft hat, sat down opposite her as if they were strangers. But he hesitated. She looked, how shall I put it, as if she'd rather he hadn't. From that moment, the case ceased to be simple. No one else remembered the man. No extra ticket was issued for Northallerton. If he boarded, he had no right to the seat. And an Eleanor's valise discovered next morning in the left luggage. Office at King's Cross. Not Euston lay another puzzle. A torn theater program from a cheap music hall in Soho, inked with a scrawl Crisp had to squint at. 7:30 sharp, don't fail me. Gee, the handwriting bore no likeness to Eleanor's own. Why would a girl of her breeding do at Lady Charlotte's, make for a Soho music hall? And why abandon her bag? The fog thickened about the affair, and with it, an unease Crisp could not name, for what began as a vanishing act now bristled with contradictions. A rendezvous hinted at in pencil, a theater scrap, a phantom gentleman. On the York Express all pointing, perhaps, to a life Eleanor Vane never confessed to those who thought they knew her best. But whether she had walked willingly into the night or been drawn there by a hand, she could not resist. That was a question only Wednesday, with its grim promise, might answer. And Wednesday was already drawing near. Inspector Crisp was not the sort of man to court assistance. Yet the strangeness of the Vane affair gnawed at him in a way no routine case did. On Tuesday evening, as the lamps along surmise burned dim through the fog, he found himself in the library of Lady Charlotte Manvers, regarding a hearth that gave little warmth, and a hostess whose composure frayed at the edges. I cannot believe Eleanor has done anything rash, she declared, Her slim hands knotted in her lap. She was the very soul of good sense, gentle, reserved, perhaps a trifle romantic, but never reckless. Her eyes darted toward the escritoire where Eleanor's letter lay. The ink barely dry. Read it, Inspector. Does that sound like a girl planning some mad escapade? Crisp read it again, though he knew the lines by heart. Polite, formal, promising arrival at 6, and yet the words rang hollow now. A mask that concealed more than they told. He folded the sheet carefully, slid it back. When did you last see her? 2 years ago, in York. We've corresponded since occasionally. A faint hesitation clung to the word, a tremor Crisp did not miss. Her father was my cousin. He died last spring. Eleanor came into a modest income, not enough to make her a target for fortune hunters. If that is what you are thinking. Crisp made no reply. Fortune hunters were crude instruments. This affair bore a subtler edge. He asked to see Eleanor's belongings. If any were here, there were none. Then he inquired about friends in London. Lady Charlotte named two, a Miss Clara Denton, lately married, and a music teacher in Bloomsbury. An older woman Eleanor had mentioned once. Neither address she could supply with certainty. Eleanor was never one for confidences, she said, and Crisp believed her. Back at the yard, the fog thick outside his window, Crisp sorted the slender sheaf of facts like cards in a rigged game. The letter, the valise at King's Cross, the torn program, the penciled word, Wednesday, and that nameless man in the soft hat. He spread them across his blotter, frowning at the contradictions, until the sound of footsteps broke his concentration. Evening. Inspector. The voice was warm, amused, a voice Crisp had come to know during cases that strayed beyond the ordinary. Lord Peter Wimsey strolled in with the easy grace of one who considered the yard his club. When boredom threatened, tall, lean, immaculate, in dove-gray tweed, he looked absurdly at home among the ink-stained tables and coal dust. Heard you've got a lady who's mislaid herself. Thought I'd drop by before Scotland Yard turns her up in a hamper. Crisp's sigh was half relief, half resignation. Blast the newspapers, he muttered, gathering the papers before Wimsey's inquisitive gaze could devour them. Yes, there's a missing girl. No, we haven't found her. And no, it's not a case for amateur theatricals. But it smells of mystery, said Wimsey, lighting a cigarette with languid elegance. And mystery, Crisp, is the one. Vice I've never cured. Tell me, what's that word doing on the back of the label? Wednesday, is it? Sounds almost biblical. Crisp hesitated, then slid the slip across. Wimsey bent over it, his monocle glittering. Curious, he murmured. Your girl disappears on Monday, yet scribbles Wednesday as if it matters. Appointment, deadline, or a warning to herself. He flipped it lightly between finger and thumb. And the bag at King's Cross, what did it hold? Nothing useful, Crisp said. Change of linen, vanity case, and this. He produced the torn program. Wimsey studied it with keen delight. Soho Music Hall, he mused. Hardly. The pastime for a young gentlewoman on her way to Mayfair. And the cryptic note, 7:30 sharp, don't fail me. G. Delicious. Your missing damsel moves in better circles than Lady Charlotte imagines. She moves in none that I can trace. Crisp said curtly, and unless you mean to waste my time, Wimsey, leave the theorizing to me. On the contrary, said Wimsey, dropping into a chair with cat-like ease, I propose to waste it most profitably. For instance, why King's Cross? She started. From York, her train ran into Euston. To leave her bag elsewhere suggests intent, not accident. She wanted it found eventually, but not before she'd gone where she meant to go. Crisp drummed his fingers on the desk. Or someone else left it. Then why not burn it? Or fling it in the Thames? Why go to the trouble of depositing it neatly ticketed at a station clerk's mercy? Wimsey smiled faintly. No, my dear Crisp. Your Eleanor is either in league with her own vanishings or playing a game whose stakes we've yet to guess. Before Crisp could retort, a constable entered with news. A witness at Euston, one of the porters, had remembered something odd. A man in a dark coat, soft hat, helping a lady into a cab Monday evening. The lady's coat was gray. The cab number? Forgotten. But the man had tipped lavishly, a sovereign for a sixpenny errand. Crisp made a note, tight-lipped. When the constable had gone, Wimsey rose, flicking ash into the grate. "Soft head again," he murmured. "Our shadowy friend appears into scenes now, the train and the cab. But here's the rub. If she was taken against her will, why no outcry at the station, to public. Ergo, she went willingly, or at least without struggle." Crisp looked up sharply. "What do you infer?" "Only that your Miss Vane knew her man, or feared something more than him. And that, my dear fellow, makes her interesting." He dropped the cigarette, crushed it delicately under heel. "What say we begin with the music hall? If G expects his lady at 7:30, perhaps he or his friends still haunt the premises." Crisp agreed, reluctantly, for he knew Whimsy's instincts were rarely at fault. Together they ventured into Soho's gaudy night, where the music hall blazed with vulgar brilliance, and the scent of cheap scent and spilled gin hung thick in the air. Backstage, among painted girls and curling smoke, the manager blinked at their questions. Yes, he'd seen the program mark his theater, sure enough. Monday night's bill had been the usual: a juggler, a comic singer, a dancing pair. No, he could not swear to any gray-coated lady in the stalls his patrons blurred after a while. But G, that raised a grin, could be George Lacey. Our tenor goes by G when he scribbles notes to his lady friends. Smooth talker, that one. Haven't seen him since Monday, though didn't turn up last night either. Funny thing, as they left the stage door, Whimsy glanced sidelong at Crisp, eyes bright. "To vanishings now, Eleanor, and your gallant G, and Wednesday lurking like a wolf in the dark. I fancy we've only just touched the fringe of this tapestry, but the pattern, that will be exquisite." And in that moment, with the Soho lamps flickering through fog and the city's heart beating fast beneath its grime, Crisp felt the first real tremor of unease. For if Whimsy was right, and he often was, then the girl who never arrived was not lost by chance. She was caught in a design so deliberate, so cold, that its center lay far beyond the glow of London's lights and the hour of reckoning. Whatever it meant was less than a day away. The following morning, the fog had not lifted, clinging to the city like a secret that refused to be told. The sky remained low and gray, as if the very air conspired to keep the truth hidden. Inspector Crisp met Lord Peter Whimsy outside the yard, both of them bracing themselves for a day that promised only further complexity. The previous night had yielded little more than confusion. George Lacey, the tenor, had not been seen since Monday, and though a dozen musicians had sworn that his mysterious G could very well match his own initials, they spoke of him with a kind of uneasy reverence. A gentleman of mystery, one had called him. There was no immediate indication that he had anything to do with Eleanor's disappearance, but the coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Now, with the light of day to sharpen their instincts, the two men set out for the next step. The manager of the music hall had agreed to show them the guest ledger, though with the wary caution of a man who had something to hide. It was a narrow ledger, leather-bound, its pages crammed with the names of half-forgotten vaudeville acts and faintly scribbled notes. Most of the names were unremarkable, the kind that would be easily erased by time or apathy. But the date from Monday night still glared at them: 7:30, and beneath it, a name that seemed utterly out of place: Eleanor Vane. It was written, not in pencil or ink, but with a hastily applied mark, almost as though someone had tried to blot it out afterward. The page was smudged, and the ink had bled slightly, as if pressed too hard with a wet pen. "She was here," Whimsy said, his voice low with something between triumph and disquiet. "What was she doing here? If she came to meet someone, why wasn't it recorded?" Crisp examined the entry carefully, running his finger along the page. "It doesn't make sense. Why would she sign in with her full name if she was meeting someone?" He looked up. Could it have been a mistake? Whimsy shook his head. No mistake. Someone wanted her here, and they wanted it known. But they didn't want her to be remembered. Not exactly. The manager fidgeted behind them, eager to be dismissed. "Is there anything else, gentlemen? I've given you all I have." Crisp ignored the man, instead focusing on the room itself. The very air seemed to tremble with unanswered questions. Every corner seemed to harbor a new shadow, a potential clue they had missed in their haste. But there were no more answers. Here, not in the ledger nor in the manager's increasingly evasive expressions. They left the music hall with little more than suspicion weighing heavily between them. Their next destination was George Lacey's flat, a modest affair, tucked between two much grander buildings in Bloomsbury. The door was answered by a young woman in an apron, who eyed them with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Is Mr. Lacey home?" Whimsy asked, his voice smooth, disarming. "Mr. Lacey hasn't been home since Monday evening," she replied, her tone flat, "and I can't say when he'll be back. Perhaps you'll want to leave a message." Whimsy smiled, but it was a thin, measured smile. "I don't think that'll be necessary." Crisp had already stepped past her and into the small hallway, his eyes narrowing at the cluttered space. "Is there anyone who might know where he's gone?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it now. He was beginning to feel the weight of the contradictions that surrounded them, all adding up like an unraveling thread. The woman hesitated, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Well, he was expecting someone, but I can't say who. I don't keep track of his affairs. If you understand me." Crisp's gaze hardened. "We're not asking for personal details, miss. Just facts. Did he say anything? Leave anything behind?" The woman's eyes darted to the table beside her, where a few crumpled letters sat. She seemed to consider, then slowly, almost reluctantly, reached for one of them. She handed it to Whimsy, who took it with deliberate care. The letter was unsigned, but the faint scent of perfume lingered on the paper. It was brief, hastily written. "Don't fail me. Lacey, I expect you at 7:30 sharp, as discussed. Your position is on the line." There was no mention of a name, no other identifying mark. It was a cryptic threat, one that seemed to cut deeper than the usual lovers' quarrels. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "I see." The woman's face flushed, but she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Lacey, he had his reasons. He wasn't always the man he seemed to be." Crisp turned to Whimsy. "What do you make of that?" Whimsy didn't answer immediately. He was studying the letter, turning it over in his hands as though it might reveal something more. Finally, he looked up. "It means Lacey's in deeper than he lets on. And this is where Eleanor Vane comes into play. She was caught in something she couldn't escape from." With that, they left the flat, the trail still cold but burning with the promise of deception. The next day, as Wednesday morning unfolded, Crisp felt an unease that had nothing to do with the lingering fog. A report had come in from the constables. A woman matching Eleanor Vane's description had been seen near a small shop in Soho, a little further down from the music hall, the very street they had visited. She had been in conversation with a man, one that fit the description of George Lacey. But the odd thing was that she had been seen entering the shop, but never leaving. No one had seen her since. "What's going on, Whimsy?" Crisp's voice was taut with frustration as they stood in front of the shop, a shabby, inconspicuous little place that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. "This is the third time now we've caught a glimpse of her, only to lose her right before we can get a full answer." Whimsy's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. "Someone's manipulating the story, or trying to, at least, and why?" Crisp's frustration was evident now. "What's the endgame?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "You know, Crisp, the world is full of people who love to be players in their own little dramas. The problem is, when the curtain rises, someone always ends up dead." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the only one that seemed to fit. The fog, which had lingered for days, seemed to close in tighter now. Someone was pulling the strings, someone who had Eleanor Vane where they wanted her. But the question remained, why? The answer, it seemed, was just out of reach. But each step they took brought them closer to each contradiction, each discrepancy, building a foundation of deceit that no one in the daylight had been able to uncover. The fog was thick, but there was a way through, and by now, Crisp knew that only the right questions would clear it away. The shop in Soho was quieter than Crisp had expected. The bell above the door jingled faintly as they entered. The scent of old paper and stale tobacco thickened the air. The proprietor, a thin man in his 50s with gray hair combed to carefully, looked up as they approached. His expression shifted slightly when he saw the two of them, more curiosity than recognition, but enough to suggest that the sight of inspectors was not a welcome one. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice tight, as if he had rehearsed the question too many times. "We're looking for a woman who was seen coming into your shop yesterday," Crisp began. his tone professional but with an edge of impatience creeping in. "A Miss Eleanor Vane. She entered this place around noon, but we've been unable to track her since." The man blinked, feigning surprise. "Eleanor Vane? You say?" "No, sir. I haven't seen anyone by that name. Not yesterday, not ever." Crisp didn't move. "You're sure?" The proprietor hesitated, eyes flicking to the small counter cluttered with odds and ends. A momentary lapse, then a forced smile. "Quite sure, Inspector. I see hundreds of faces in here. Can't remember them all." Whimsy, who had been quietly observing the exchange, cleared his throat. "What exactly is it that you sell here, Mr. Barnes?" "Books, sir," the man said, a little too quickly. "Old books, mostly, first editions, if you're interested. I buy and sell on occasion. A few rare items here and there." He gestured to the shelves behind him, filled with stacks of leather-bound volumes that looked more like a maze than a collection. "And how long have you been in business here?" Whimsy asked, his voice casually inquisitive. 25 years, give or take." "Ah, a reputable establishment," Whimsy mused, eyes glinting. "I imagine you'd have quite a few valuable items on hand, then." The proprietor's eyes narrowed slightly, then he cleared his throat. "I'd hardly call them valuable, sir. They're simply old books." "Of course," Whimsy said, though his tone carried a trace of something else, something that made the man shift on his feet. "I'm sure that's true, but it strikes me as odd that someone would come into a shop like this to meet with a woman like Eleanor Vane. Not that I have any particular knowledge of her, mind you, but I imagine she'd prefer more fashionable surroundings than a bookshop like this." The man's throat tightened, his fingers twitching at the edge of the counter. He had already revealed more than he intended. "I'm afraid I can't help you, gentlemen," he repeated, his smile now stiff and forced. "Maybe you should try asking around elsewhere." Crisp looked at Whimsy, who gave him a small nod. "Perhaps we will, Mr. Barnes," Crisp said, taking a step toward the door. "But don't think we won't be back." Outside, the fog was thicker than before, but there was a sense of something shifting in the air. As they walked down the narrow street, Crisp felt a gnawing sensation in his gut, a feeling that something had just slipped through his fingers, and he wasn't sure what it was yet. "What do you make of Barnes?" Crisp asked, his voice low. "Whimsy looked thoughtful. "He's lying about something, that much is certain. He might not have known Eleanor personally, but I believe he knew exactly what she was up to in that shop. And whatever happened, he's part of the web. The question is, what part?" Crisp nodded. "There's a man who knows more than he's telling, and I intend to find out what it is. But for now, we need to start connecting the dots. Barnes might not have the answers, but someone else might." Back at the yard, the investigation hit another dead end. George Lacey remained a ghost, his flat empty, no messages, no trace of where he'd gone. The constables had done their best, but nothing turned up to suggest his whereabouts. Still, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, and the questions multiplied. Crisp sat alone in his office, the daylight waning outside. He reviewed the list of names, the clues, the contradictions. The timing was crucial. Eleanor's disappearance coincided with George Lacey's sudden absence, and the music hall connection suggested a deeper involvement than anyone had expected. But none of it explained the most important part of the puzzle. Why? There had to be a reason Eleanor Vane had disappeared, something she'd known, something she'd been drawn into. Was it money, revenge, or perhaps something more personal? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the constables, holding a small stack of letters. "These were delivered just now, sir. They were addressed to you from the music hall manager." Crisp frowned, taking the letters from the constable. The handwriting was unremarkable, scraggly. Hurried, he tore the first one open. "Inspector Crisp, I have information that might be of interest to you regarding Eleanor Vane. She was involved with someone at the music hall, someone powerful and dangerous. You need to find him before it's too late. I will meet you at midnight at the corner of Fleet and Holborn." A friend letter was unsigned, but Crisp felt a weight settle in his chest. This was the break they'd been waiting for, but it came with a price. He turned to Whimsy, who had followed him into the office, reading over his shoulder. "Do you think it's a trap?" Whimsy asked, his voice almost a whisper. Crisp rubbed his chin, his mind racing. Maybe. But if it's true, we're running out of time. This person knows more than they're letting on. I'll go with you, Whimsy said quietly. But be prepared for anything. The moment we're there, someone will know we're onto them. And when that happens, they'll try to cover their tracks. Crisp nodded, his mind already preparing for the worst. The letters had added a new layer of uncertainty, but they also confirmed what he had suspected all along. There was something larger at play, something hidden beneath the surface, the web of motives, greed, revenge. Fear was closing in around them. Each thread they pulled seemed to lead to another, tangled and confused. And yet, despite the contradictions and the false leads, Crisp was beginning to see a clearer picture. Every suspect had a reason to be involved, every witness a motive to lie. But no single theory explained everything. As they prepared to leave for the meeting, Crisp knew that the next few hours would reveal whether they were walking straight into danger or if at last they were about to uncover the truth. And in that moment, with the fog creeping in from the streets outside, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The case of Eleanor Vane was no longer just a disappearance. It was a carefully orchestrated game, and they were players in a much larger scheme than they could have imagined. The night was colder than usual, and the fog had thickened, swallowing the streets whole as Crisp and Whimsy made their way to the appointed corner of Fleet and Holborn. The city seemed eerily quiet, the usual murmur of life dulled by the oppressive mist that wrapped itself around every building, every lamppost, every street. They stood in the shadows, the minutes stretching on like an unbroken silence, until Crisp's patience finally snapped. "I don't like it," he muttered, glancing at his watch. Midnight was fast approaching, and so far, no one had appeared. "Whoever wrote that letter knew we'd be here, but it's starting to feel like we're being strung along." Whimsy said nothing at first, his eyes scanning the fog as though he expected something or someone to emerge from the murk. "You're right. The whole thing smells of a setup, but I'll admit, I don't like the fact that we've been led this far. Too many people are lying about too much." A figure appeared out of the mist, dark and cloaked, moving with the swiftness of someone who knew they were being pursued. At first, Crisp couldn't make out their features, but as the figure drew closer, the flickering lamplight revealed a familiar face. It was George Lacey. Crisp's hand instinctively went to his pocket, but Whimsy was quicker. He stepped forward, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Mr. Lacey, a pleasure to meet you at last." Lacey stopped short, eyes wide in startled recognition. "I didn't expect you to be here," he stammered, his words uneven, like someone caught between desperation and fear. I thought I'd have more time." "Time for what?" Crisp demanded, narrowing his gaze. "You're not fooling anyone, Lacey. We've been tracking you for days. Eleanor Vane is missing, and you're the one at the center of it all." Lacey swallowed hard, his face pale under the lamplight. "You don't understand. I never meant for any of this to happen." He looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to emerge from the mist. But there was only the empty street. She wasn't supposed to get involved. What did you do to her?" Whimsy's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath the words. Lacey looked back at them, his eyes darting between the two men. He shook his head, then sighed deeply. "I never meant to hurt her. I swear it. But Eleanor, she got into deep. It was never supposed to go this far." Crisp took a step forward. "Explain yourself." Lacey's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been involved with some dangerous people. They wanted me to do something, get close to her, make sure she didn't talk. She knew too much, and she started asking questions. I tried to warn her, tried to get her out, but she refused. She wouldn't leave." His words came faster now, desperate. "I didn't think she'd actually come to London. I thought it was all over. I never meant for her to disappear, but I couldn't let her ruin everything." There was a long silence as Lacey's confession hung in the air, the weight of it settling between them. For a moment, Crisp stood frozen, his mind racing. It made sense, in a way. Lacey's desperation, the way he had been seen at the music hall, the connection to Eleanor. It all clicked. The pieces fell into place. "Where is she now?" Crisp's voice was cold, hard. "What have you done to her?" Lacey looked away. His expression tortured. "I didn't hurt her, but I can't help you find her. You don't understand. Inspector, there are people, dangerous people who would kill me if I said anything. You think I care about them?" Crisp's voice was low, his anger barely contained. "You've dragged an innocent girl into this mess. You're going to tell me everything." Lacey opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of distant footsteps interrupted him. He froze, his eyes widening. "You don't know what you're up against," he whispered urgently, his voice trembling. "They'll come for both of you. You can't stop them. Get out of here. Go." Before Crisp could respond, Lacey turned and fled into the mist, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had arrived. Crisp stood there, his heart pounding, his thoughts a whirlwind. "Damned fool," he muttered, his hand still hovering near his pocket. "He's gone. Just like that. No answers, no closure." Whimsy was watching him closely, a slow smile forming on his lips. "You think it's over, don't you? That Lacey's told us the whole truth." Crisp turned to him, frowning. "What do you mean?" Whimsy chuckled softly. "It's too neat, too perfect. Lacey's confession, his panic. Everything he said, it's almost as if he was leading us to the conclusion. He tells us just enough to make us think we've solved it, but not enough to be sure. He's playing us." Crisp's eyes narrowed. "So you think it's a lie?" "I think it's a half-truth," Whimsy replied, his voice tinged with amusement. "Lacey may have been involved, but he's not the one behind it. He's not the one pulling the strings." Crisp's thoughts flashed back to the letters, the cryptic messages, the strange meeting in Soho. "Then who's been manipulating all of this?" Whimsy smiled, but it was a smile filled with something darker, recognition, perhaps, or a flicker of understanding. "We've been chasing ghosts, Crisp, and now Lacey has given us just enough to chase the wrong one." Crisp clenched his fists, the frustration of the case threatening to overwhelm him. "So we've been played. This whole time, we've been led down the wrong path." Whimsy nodded. "You've been too quick to believe the story Lacey wanted you to hear. The real criminal is still out there, watching us. And Eleanor, she's the key to everything." They stood in the fog for a moment, the city around them quiet and still, as if holding its breath. Crisp felt the weight of the case pressing down on him, the realization that they were no closer to the truth than they had been days ago. Lacey's confession was a false victory, a trap laid to mislead them, and now the game had changed. "We need to go back to square one," Crisp muttered, his mind whirling with new possibilities. "We need to look at everything again from the beginning, all the lies, all the misdirection." Whimsy grinned. "That's the spirit. Let's unravel the real story, shall we? But this time, let's not settle for the obvious answers." And so they turned, heading back into the fog, knowing that the true game had only just begun. The false victory was a bitter reminder that, in their pursuit of the truth, they had only uncovered the surface, and beneath it, something far more dangerous, something far darker was waiting to be revealed. The fog remained stubbornly dense, even as the early hours of morning began to stretch and blur into the pale blue of dawn. Crisp's mind buzzed with the weight of everything they'd discovered and everything they hadn't. Lacey's false confession still lingered, a sharp point of frustration that threatened to unravel their every lead. They'd been misled, but worse, they'd been rushed to conclusions. Something deeper lay hidden, and it was just out of reach. Whimsy, ever the optimist, seemed to take the whole affair as one big puzzle, but even his playful wit had faded, replaced by a more thoughtful silence. They were on the right track. Of that Crisp had no doubt, but now the question was where to look next. They needed to rethink everything, reconsider the very structure of the case, because the answer wasn't in the obvious places. As they walked back to the yard, Crisp's eyes caught a small detail that had been buried in the back of his mind for days, something that had passed unnoticed amidst the chaos of Eleanor Vane's disappearance. A name that was starting to haunt him, Lady Charlotte Manvers. The thought dropped into his head like a stone, creating ripples in his mind. He paused in his tracks, and Whimsy, sensing the change in his posture, stopped beside him. "What is it?" Whimsy asked, his voice measured, as though waiting for a breakthrough. "I've been blind, Whimsy," Crisp said, the words coming out in a rush. "Lady Charlotte. She's connected to all of this." There's something about her I missed. Whimsy's eyes narrowed, an understanding beginning to take shape. The woman who sent Eleanor to London, the one who should have known her best. Crisp nodded. The pieces clicking together. She's the key. Eleanor's disappearance, Lacey's involvement. The music hall, there's a thread that runs through all of it, and it leads straight to her. You're saying Lady Charlotte is involved? No. Crisp muttered, shaking his head. Not directly, but there's more to her than we've been told. There's something in her past, something she's hiding, that connects her to this whole mess. Whimsy smiled, though it was a slow, careful smile. Now we're getting somewhere. Let's pay her another visit, shall we? They arrived at Lady Charlotte's residence by mid-morning. The house, tucked quietly away in Mayfair, stood in sharp contrast to the turmoil the case had caused. It was a home of wealth and refinement, a place where no one would expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But Crisp wasn't fooled. He knew now that wealth could conceal the darkest of secrets. They were ushered inside by the same housemaid who had greeted them earlier. Lady Charlotte was seated in the drawing room, her posture as poised as ever, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of tension when she saw them. She had known they would come again. There was no surprise on her face, only a weary resignation. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I assume you've come to speak to me about Eleanor." Crisp exchanged a look with Whimsy, who nodded in his subtle way. "Yes, Lady Charlotte. We've come to ask some more questions we should have asked before. I see." Her eyes didn't waver. "What is it that you want to know?" "Eleanor has vanished. That is the truth of it. I've told you all I know." Crisp studied her closely, noting the faintest quiver in her hand as she lifted her teacup to her lips. "I think you've told us part of the truth, but there's more. Eleanor's disappearance isn't as random as it seems. We know she had some connection to George Lacey, and that there's something about her visit to London that doesn't add up." Lady Charlotte's expression remained carefully composed, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes now, something that said she knew exactly what was going on. "I'm afraid I don't follow," she said smoothly. "Lady Charlotte." Crisp pressed, "I've been thinking about something. Eleanor's father passed away last spring, but her inheritance, what she was left with, wasn't enough to cause any major stir. Your family, if you knew her so well, why would she have been involved in something so dangerous? What could possibly have brought her to Soho, to a music hall, to a place like that?" Lady Charlotte hesitated, her lips trembling slightly, but she didn't speak. Whimsy, ever the tactician, stepped in. "There's something you're not telling us, isn't there? Something about your family's past. Perhaps you know more about Eleanor's motivations than you're letting on." The silence in the room grew heavy, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Lady Charlotte set down her teacup with a quiet click. Her eyes, no longer the picture of calm composure, met Crisp's with an unspoken understanding. "You're right," she said, her voice dropping lower. "There's more to Eleanor's story than I've told you, but it's not something I'm proud of. It's not something she should have known." "What do you mean?" Crisp's voice was sharp, his instincts on edge. Lady Charlotte's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers curling into the folds of her dress. "Eleanor's father, my cousin, was a part of something that happened many years ago. He was involved in a business venture, illegal, to put it bluntly. He had connections, dangerous ones. I was only a child when it all started, but when he died, I learned more about his dealings, and so did Eleanor." Crisp felt a cold chill settle over him. "What kind of dealings?" Lady Charlotte sighed, the weight of the past pressing down on her. "My father and my cousin had invested in something. They'd made arrangements with the wrong people, criminals. When the venture collapsed, some of those people came looking for retribution. I was sent away, but my cousin, he couldn't escape them, and neither could Eleanor." Crisp's blood ran cold. "You're saying Eleanor was caught up in this mess? That she didn't just go missing by accident? Someone wanted her dead?" Lady Charlotte's eyes welled with unshed tears. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Eleanor didn't know. She couldn't have known the danger she was walking into. I tried to protect her, but she wanted to be independent, wanted to make her own decisions. She kept asking questions about things that were better left alone." Whimsy glanced at Crisp, the realization dawning in his eyes. Eleanor's disappearance was no accident, was it? She knew too much. Lady Charlotte shook her head. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough to make herself a target. And now, you've uncovered the truth, Inspector. What you didn't know is that Eleanor's disappearance is only part of something much darker. A debt my family never paid, and now it's come back to collect. The room grew still. Crisp felt the ground shift beneath him, the case taking on an entirely new weight. What had seemed like a puzzle was now a tangled web of secrets and old betrayals, stretching back to a past that no one wanted to remember. And in that moment, Crisp understood the crime was never just about Eleanor. It had always been about the sins of those who came before her, and now those shadows were closing in on them all. The revelation in Lady Charlotte's drawing room had shaken Crisp to his core. The twisted truth about Eleanor's disappearance dangled in the dark corners of family secrets. Criminal debts and long-buried scandals had left him with more questions than answers. But now the pieces were finally starting to fit together. The tangled web of deception had deep roots, and it wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about the sins of the past, the debts owed, and the people who had been silently pulling the strings. But there was something else, something that still didn't sit right. Lady Charlotte's confession, though it cast light on the murky past, had also raised the question: who was still trying to silence Eleanor? Who had come after her, and why? Hadn't they been satisfied with simply erasing her from the picture? Crisp's mind raced. The key to finding Eleanor now lay not just in her disappearance, but in the actions of those around her. He needed a way to provoke someone, a way to push a suspect to reveal their true nature. Whimsy. Sensing his friend's growing frustration, watched as Crisp meticulously scanned through the case files again. There was nothing new about Lady Charlotte's story that hadn't already been hinted at. No, they needed a more unconventional approach, a method to break through the walls of deception that had been built around this case. I'm going to try something, Crisp said, breaking the silence between them. Something a bit unorthodox. Whimsy looked up, his curiosity piqued. Unorthodox, that's a bit vague. What exactly are you planning? Crisp tapped a finger on the edge of the desk. I'm going to test them, the suspects, one by one. Not with questions, not with logic. I'm going to test their reactions. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Reactions? How? The mind is often the most revealing instrument we have. People lie with words, but their true feelings, those are easier to detect when they're not expecting it. I'll push their buttons. See how they react when their carefully constructed lies start to crumble. They won't even know what's happening. It was a psychological gambit, one that had worked before in situations like this, though it carried its risks. But after everything they'd uncovered, Crisp was done waiting for people to make mistakes on their own. He needed to create those mistakes. The truth lay hidden in the cracks of their facades, and it was time to pry those cracks wide. The first target was, predictably, George Lacey. Though he had already fled the scene in Soho, the inspector knew that Lacey wasn't the type to stay hidden for long. People like him, desperate, tangled in their own lies, always made the mistake of returning to the places they thought they could control. As they arrived at Lacey's flat once more, the familiar smell of stale air greeted them. The building was just as grim and unwelcoming as before, but this time there was a flicker of light in one of the upstairs windows, a sign of life. They were close. Crisp stepped forward, his hand resting on the doorknob, when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Whimsy had a look in his eye that suggested he had been mulling over something. You're not thinking of just barging in, are you? Whimsy asked. After all this, subtlety's probably a better approach. I'm not here for subtlety, Crisp replied, his voice steady but carrying a hard edge. I'm here for a confession. With a sharp turn of the knob, the door creaked open. They were met with the same disarray that had marked the flat earlier. Nothing had changed. Lacey's things were still scattered around, untouched. It was almost too quiet. Then they heard it, a muffled sound from the back of the flat. A shuffling noise, faint but distinct. They moved toward it and found Lacey crouched behind a partition, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear as they locked onto the two men. I thought you were gone, Lacey stammered, his voice cracking. Apparently, you thought wrong, Crisp said, stepping closer. His tone was casual, but there was an underlying tension. that made Lacey shift uncomfortably. "I don't know what you want from me." Lacey's voice rose higher than it should have. "A subtle giveaway. I told you everything I knew. What else is there?" Crisp eyed him carefully. This was the moment. He wasn't going to ask the same questions again. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his gaze never leaving Lacey's face. "You know, George," he began, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I've been thinking about your story, about how you said Eleanor was involved in something she shouldn't have been, but I don't think you've told me the whole truth. You say you tried to protect her, but..." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But did you?" Lacey's eyes flickered with something Crisp couldn't quite place. Panic? Guilt? Or was it something else, something darker? The inspector pressed on. "Maybe you didn't mean for her to get hurt, but if she had to die, I wonder, George, would it have been to protect your secret or to save yourself?" Lacey flinched, his hand twitching as though he were about to reach for something. The subtle movement was enough for Crisp to see the crack in his story, a sudden shift in the man's demeanor. Lacey's mouth tightened, and his eyes darted nervously to the side, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. "You're wrong," Lacey whispered. "I never hurt her. I just wanted to get out. You don't understand what they would do to me if I talked." His voice broke slightly as he spoke the words. Whimsy stepped forward, his usual air of affability gone. "You're hiding something, that much is clear. But the real question is, who are you really afraid of, George? Because it's not us." Lacey's eyes widened at the mention of them, the shadowy figures from his past, and something inside him snapped. His hands trembled as he pushed himself back, as if trying to put space between himself and the truth. I didn't kill her," Lacey gasped, his voice rising. "But I know who did. I didn't want to get involved, but they would have found me anyway. He cut himself off, his body stiffening as if realizing he'd gone too far. The air was thick with the tension now. Crisp leaned in, lowering his voice. "Who, George? Who are you talking about? Who is they?" For the first time since the conversation began, Lacey's face shifted from fear to something else, something more calculating. A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips, as if he had anticipated this moment all along. "You really don't get it, do you?" he whispered, his voice now cold and measured. "You think you've been chasing Eleanor's ghosts, but you've been chasing mine." It was a slip, one that revealed far more than he intended. The carefully constructed persona of the scared man fell apart, leaving behind a glimpse of something far darker. And just like that, Crisp understood. Lacey had known exactly what was happening all along. He hadn't just been a pawn. He had been a player. The unexpected reveal sent a chill down Crisp's spine. The game had shifted once again. They were no longer just hunting the truth, they were now dealing with someone who was far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. The pieces were falling into place, but the final piece, the one that would explain it all, was still out there, just beyond reach. The walls of Lacey's flat felt oppressive now, the air heavy with the realization that the investigation had taken a dangerous turn. The confession, though partial, had cracked open a new door, one that led straight into the heart of the conspiracy. Crisp was certain that Lacey knew more than he was willing to admit, and the mention of ghosts in his final words had hinted at something even more sinister lurking just beneath the surface. But even with this new lead, something still felt off. Crisp and Whimsy left the flat in silence, both of them deep in thought as they made their way to the yard. They had the pieces of the puzzle now: the cryptic threats, Lacey's involvement, Lady Charlotte's confession about the criminal dealings of her family. But each revelation brought more questions, and with every new question came the realization that they were not dealing with a simple case of a missing woman. They were involved in something far darker, with shadows stretching far back into the past. Once at the yard, Crisp immediately went to his office. The adrenaline was still surging through his veins, the case now feeling like a personal challenge, one he couldn't afford to lose. He sat down and began reviewing the evidence again, a sudden urgency pulsing in him as though the solution was just within reach. His eyes flicked over the files, each one a thread to be pulled. There was the letter from the anonymous source, the information from Lady Charlotte, the mention of the dangerous figures from Lacey's past. It all pointed toward something big, but the connections were still murky. Whimsy entered, with a small frown, carrying a manila envelope. "I got a call from the lab," he said, tossing the envelope onto Crisp's desk. "They've finished analyzing the items we found at Lacey's flat. The cigarette butts, the torn papers. They didn't give us much, but there was one thing they couldn't explain." Crisp looked up, his brow furrowing. "What's that?" "They found traces of a specific kind of ink on one of the torn papers," Whimsy continued. "It's used in very high-end printers, generally not something you'd see in a flat like Lacey's." Crisp's heart skipped a beat. "High-end printers, yeah, the kind of printers used in corporate settings. They said it was something rare, linked to a specific company that does secure document printing. But the strangest part, there's no mention of it in the records. It's been erased." Crisp felt a tightening in his chest. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Erased, exactly. It's as if someone has been actively removing any trace of this ink from the system. Who would want to do that? Crisp asked, his mind racing. Someone trying to hide the real reason behind Eleanor's disappearance? Whimsy didn't respond right away, but Crisp saw the flicker of realization in his eyes. "Exactly," Whimsy said. "Someone's trying to bury the truth, and we're getting too close to it." Crisp's thoughts churned. If someone had been deliberately erasing evidence, it meant they were watching, waiting for the detectives to come too close. The sudden urgency was more than just paranoia, it was real, and worse. It meant that they had just become the target. Before Crisp could speak further, a constable entered with a note in hand. His expression was grim. "Sir, there's been an incident." Crisp's blood ran cold. "What kind of incident?" "The evidence locker. The files, they've been tampered with." Crisp and Whimsy exchanged a glance, the weight of the situation settling over them both. "Tampered with how?" Crisp demanded. "It's gone, sir," the constable said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The folder. The one with the document we pulled from Lacey's flat, the one with the ink. It's gone. Completely disappeared." The floor beneath Crisp seemed to shift, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "It was in our custody." The constable nodded, his face pale. "I don't know how, sir. The evidence locker was locked. There's no sign of forced entry, but when we opened it just now, it was gone. Like someone had taken it without leaving a trace." Crisp's mind raced. They had just been on the verge of a breakthrough. Now, that evidence, the key to the puzzle, was gone. Stolen, destroyed, or altered, either way. It meant someone had anticipated their every move and was actively working to obstruct the investigation. "This is no longer just a case of missing persons," Crisp said quietly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Whoever is behind this is playing a much bigger game than we thought, and they're not afraid to go to extreme lengths to keep us from the truth." Whimsy looked over at him, his expression hardening. "We can't let them win, Crisp. We've come too far." Crisp nodded, his fists clenching. "No, we'll find a way. We can't let them cover this up." They left the office quickly, making their way down the long hall toward the evidence locker. The constable led the way, but there was an eerie silence hanging in the air. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one had the courage to voice it yet. When they reached the evidence room, Crisp's eyes immediately went to the lock. It was secure. There were no signs of tampering, no broken seals. But still, the folder was missing. "This doesn't make sense," Whimsy muttered. "How could someone get in without triggering any alarms?" Crisp looked around, his eyes scanning the room. He knew the feeling of being watched, and now, more than ever, it was undeniable. Whoever had stolen the evidence had known the exact moment they would be distracted, the exact moment they could strike. The implication was clear. Someone inside the yard, someone close to the investigation, had played a role in this. "We need to go through the chain of custody," Crisp said, his voice hard. "Someone here is working against us." But as they began to retrace their steps, Crisp could already feel the tension mounting. With every moment, the mystery grew deeper and the danger more palpable. They were no longer just solving a case. They were fighting an invisible war, one where the truth itself was the ultimate casualty. The stakes were higher now, and trust had become a fragile thing. As Crisp walked down the dimly lit corridor, his thoughts churned. He had once believed that finding the right clues was the hardest part of a case, but now he understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing was what wasn't found, the secrets that slipped through the cracks, the lies that weren't yet uncovered. And someone was willing to do anything to ensure those secrets stayed buried. They had to act fast, before the entire case slipped out of their hands entirely. The days had become a blur of tension, each step in the investigation drawing them closer to the truth, yet always seeming to lead into another dead end. The stolen evidence was still a mystery, as was the shadowy figure orchestrating it all from the dark corners of the city. Crisp knew one thing for certain: they were being watched. Every move they made was being anticipated, and now they were playing catch-up. The clock ticked louder in Crisp's mind with each passing hour. He couldn't afford to lose another piece of evidence, another lead, but he knew that someone, somewhere, was pulling the strings behind the scenes, keeping one step ahead. The room felt smaller, more claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves were closing in. It was late one evening when the sharp ring of the phone broke through the suffocating silence of Crisp's office. His hand, poised over a pile of case files, froze. With a quick glance at Whimsy, who had been seated across from him, Crisp picked up the receiver. "Crisp," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was already on edge. "Sir." The voice on the other end was strained. "We have another body." The words struck like a blow to the chest. Crisp's pulse quickened. "Another body? Where?" "South of the river, near the old docks." Same area as before, but this time the voice faltered. "It's Lacey. He's been found, sir, dead." The phone slipped from Crisp's fingers, his mind racing, trying to process the shock of the revelation. Lacey, the one person who had seemed to hold the key to everything, was now dead, murdered. And just like that, the investigation had taken a devastating twist. "We need to move now," Whimsy said, his voice sharp as he stood. Crisp nodded, still processing the news, but his instincts kicked in immediately. He was already reaching for his coat, his mind now on the next step. By the time they arrived at the scene, the area was swarming with officers. The docks were dark, the air thick with the smell of salt water and old wood, and the distant hum of the city seemed to echo faintly in the background. A crowd of onlookers had gathered at the perimeter, but the police had already cordoned off the area. The body of George Lacey lay in the center, his face pale, his eyes wide open in an expression of pure terror. Crisp approached the body with a slow, deliberate step. There was something off about the scene, something that didn't add up. Lacey's body had been left in the middle of the dock, exposed to the elements, as though someone wanted it to be found. But why? Why leave him here, in such a conspicuous place? "Do we know how he died?" Crisp asked one of the officers who had been standing nearby. The officer glanced at the body, his face grim. "We don't have a cause of death yet, sir, but it looks like he was strangled. No sign of a struggle. And there's this." He pointed to a small scrap of paper clutched in Lacey's hand. Crisp leaned in, taking the paper gently from Lacey's stiff fingers. It was a single word, written in a hurried scrawl: "Doomed." Crisp's stomach twisted. The word was an ominous message, one that only deepened the mystery. It wasn't just a crime. It was a statement. Whimsy stood beside him, his expression thoughtful. "This doesn't feel like the work of someone trying to cover their tracks. It's almost as if they want us to see this. Lacey didn't just die. He was sent a message." Crisp nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift again. Lacey had been involved in something far bigger than just the criminal dealings he had been caught up in. Whoever had killed him wasn't just tying up loose ends, they were making a statement. They were telling Crisp that he was too close to the truth. Whoever did this wanted us to know that Lacey was scared. They wanted us to see that his death wasn't just random. He was terrified. Crisp's voice was low, the weight of the case pressing on him more heavily now than ever. "And now, they're sending a message to us. But why? What's their next move?" Whimsy looked over at the crowd of officers and the gathered onlookers. "There's something else, isn't there? This feels like more than just a random act of violence." Crisp straightened, his gaze never leaving Lacey's body. "It's not random," he said firmly. "Someone wants us to follow them. They're leading us somewhere." As they continued to survey the scene, Crisp felt a sudden chill run down his spine. Something in the back of his mind clicked, and for the first time since they'd started this case, he felt the overwhelming weight of danger. It wasn't just about finding the killer anymore. It was about preventing the next crime, the next victim. Lacey had been a warning, and Crisp wasn't sure they could stop what was coming next. The hours passed, but the questions only multiplied. The cause of Lacey's death was confirmed as strangulation, and his body had been left in a location designed for maximum exposure. But the message doomed remained the most chilling aspect of it all. It wasn't just a cryptic word. It was a threat, a warning. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing a game, they were trying to control the narrative, to lead them down a path they couldn't predict. Crisp returned to his office late that night, his mind heavy with the weight of Lacey's death. He sat in silence for a long while, looking over the case files, replaying every conversation, every clue, every misstep they had made so far. And then, as if by instinct, his hand hovered over the files on Lacey again, the ones that had been stolen from the evidence locker. He had to admit it now, the stakes had shifted. The real enemy wasn't just some petty criminal hiding in the shadows. It was someone who had been manipulating them all along. Someone who had known how to make each step seem like the right one, only to turn the knife when they least expected it. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up quickly. "Crisp," he said, his voice tight. "Inspector, it's the lab," the voice on the other end said, barely audible through the static. "We've got something on the evidence from Lacey's flat. You need to see this." The hairs on the back of Crisp's neck stood on end. It wasn't just a simple clue. It was something more, something that could break the case wide open. But there was no time to waste. The game had changed, and they were now in a race to stop whatever was coming next. Whoever was behind all of this was still one step ahead, and they were playing a game with rules that no one had fully understood. Crisp's grip on the phone tightened. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. But as he stood to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was already running out. The villain wasn't just hiding behind the shadows anymore. They were coming out into the open, and this time, they weren't waiting to be found. The night was oppressive, the kind of night that swallowed up every sound and left only the clatter of thoughts echoing in Crisp's mind. He'd barely slept in the past 48 hours, and yet, there was no time to rest. The case had taken a turn, no longer just about solving the mystery of Eleanor's disappearance, but a full-blown race against time, with a killer several steps ahead. He arrived at the lab shortly after receiving the call. The sterile, cold room was a far cry from the warm bustle of the yard. Inside, the forensic team had already begun their analysis, and one of the technicians, a young woman named Riley, was waiting for him. "Inspector," she greeted him with a brisk nod. "You need to see this." Crisp followed her to the workbench where a file lay open. It wasn't much, just a scrap of paper, the same kind of paper they had found in Lacey's hand. This one, however, was a little different. The ink was faint, but it was still readable, a barely legible scrawl. "The circle tightens. Watch the doors." Crisp's fingers trembled slightly as he traced the words. The message wasn't just cryptic, it was directed at him. There was a rhythm to it, a cold, calculating precision. "Watch the doors." The phrase had been hauntingly familiar, like a verse from an old warning. But why? What did it mean? "Do you think this is connected to the pattern?" Riley asked. "There's no doubt," Crisp muttered, his mind racing. "Someone wants us to know they're still in control. They want to lead us into a trap." Whimsy arrived moments later, his face taut with the same tension that had begun to gnaw at Crisp. The two of them exchanged a look that said everything without words. The case wasn't just unraveling, it was shifting, and the fabric of it was beginning to tear apart. They weren't chasing the truth anymore. They were being herded toward it. "Crisp," Whimsy said, his voice low, "I've been thinking. This all feels staged. The murders, the messages, the timing. It's like they're trying to tell us something, make us think it's one thing when it's another." Crisp paused, considering Whimsy's words. A pattern. There had been something nagging at the back of his mind ever since they discovered Lacey's body. The events were too orchestrated, too neatly placed for a random killer. They were being drawn into a game, and each move had been carefully calculated. There had to be a pattern to it all. They just hadn't seen it yet. "I think you're right," Crisp said, his voice suddenly clearer. "We've been too focused on the obvious, the murders, the stolen evidence, Lacey's role in all this. But we're missing something smaller." Whimsy looked at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Crisp's gaze shifted toward the stack of case files on the table. "When I looked over everything again, there was a detail, something small, but important. It's not the evidence or the bodies, it's the people around the case." "What about them?" Whimsy asked, the gears already turning in his mind. "Think about it," Crisp said, his tone more deliberate now. "Every time we've had a breakthrough, there's been someone in the background, someone watching. Lacey, Eleanor, the people who should have been our prime suspects, Lady Charlotte, the anonymous tipster, even the police officers in the case, they're all part of the same web, like pawns in a game," Whimsy suggested. "Exactly," Crisp replied, his mind clicking into place. "But there's one person who's been consistently overlooked, a detail that we dismissed at first, but it's been staring us in the face all along." Whimsy's expression shifted, sensing where this was going. "Who, the informant?" Crisp said. "The one who gave us the first tip about Eleanor's disappearance. The person who said Lacey was involved in something he shouldn't have been. We never questioned them. We took the tip at face value. But what if they were the real player behind this? What if they've been manipulating everything from the start?" The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The informant had been the one to point them in Lacey's direction, and they had followed the lead without hesitation. But now it seemed too perfect, too convenient. The informant knew exactly what they needed to hear, knew exactly where to push them. What if they were controlling the investigation from behind the scenes? What if they were the one pulling all the strings? This is where the pattern emerges. Crisp muttered to himself. The informant's role has been more than just a tip-off. They've been setting up the pieces. Whimsy was silent for a moment as the weight of the theory sank in. "So you think the person who tipped us off has been orchestrating everything? Lacey's murder, the stolen evidence, it all points back to them." "Yes," Crisp replied, his eyes narrowing with determination. "We've been following false trails. Lacey was just a pawn. Eleanor was just a piece on the board. The true mastermind has been using them both to lead us to the final move." Whimsy's face tightened as he processed the new direction. "But who could it be? Who's been hiding in the shadows, making sure we stay on the wrong path?" Crisp's thoughts flickered back to Lady Charlotte. She had been a key part of the investigation from the very start, and yet she had always been one step ahead, manipulating the narrative with her carefully crafted words. She'd been quick to volunteer information, but was it all true? Or was she the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes? "No," Crisp said, shaking his head. "It's not Lady Charlotte. She's too obvious. The real informant is someone who's been under our radar the whole time." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Crisp's gaze swept over the case files again, but this time his focus was different. He wasn't looking at the names or the events. He was looking for something that didn't belong. A small, insignificant detail that had always been in plain sight, but had never seemed important. And then it hit him. "Riley," Crisp said suddenly, "the technician from the lab. She was the one who first found the ink in Lacey's flat. Remember?" Whimsy stared at him. "You think she's the informant?" "I don't just think it, Whimsy," Crisp replied. "I'm sure of it. The pattern makes sense now. She's been feeding us information, guiding us through the case, making sure we follow the clues she wants us to follow. She's the one behind it all." The realization settled over them both. The quiet, unassuming technician had been the one orchestrating everything. She had been the key player, the one who had known how to make them chase the wrong leads. And now it was clear that she had been working against them from the very beginning. But why? What was her endgame? Crisp's mind raced again. But this time, there was no uncertainty. He had the pattern. Now, it was time to stop playing into her hands. They needed to confront Riley, and fast, before she could make her final move. "This ends tonight," Crisp said, his voice cold with resolve. The air in the lab felt dense as Crisp and Whimsy prepared to confront Riley. The tension between them was palpable, thickened by the shock of the realization. That she had been behind everything, behind the stolen evidence, the murders, the manipulation of the investigation. Every thread they had followed had been pulled by her invisible hands. "We need to move quickly," Crisp said, his voice cutting through the silence. "She'll have anticipated our next move." Whimsy nodded, his jaw clenched. "But why, Crisp? Why go through all this trouble? What does she stand to gain?" Crisp's thoughts were still spinning, but now he understood. He had seen the pattern, the subtle manipulations, the small, seemingly insignificant details that had led him to Riley. But the motive, her true motive, remained unclear, elusive. Hidden beneath layers of careful deception, they headed for the lab where Riley had been working for hours, processing the evidence from Lacey's flat. The closer they got, the heavier the weight of the situation felt. The thought that someone they had trusted, someone who had seemed so innocuous, was at the heart of this labyrinth of lies was disorienting, but there was no turning back now. When they entered the room, Riley was standing at the workbench, her back to them, the hum of the machines the only sound breaking the silence. She didn't seem surprised by their sudden appearance, nor did she acknowledge their presence immediately. Her focus was entirely on the sample she was analyzing under a microscope. It was almost as if she was waiting for them. "Riley," Crisp said, his voice firm. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Inspector, Mr. Whimsy." There was no hint of guilt, no sign of the panic that would have been expected from someone who had just been exposed. Instead, she seemed almost detached, as if this was nothing more than a formality. "You've been busy," Whimsy said, his voice laced with disdain, "feeding us false leads, sending us on wild goose chases. The question is, why?" Riley's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She stepped away from the bench, her movements deliberate, as though she was enjoying the moment. "It's a good question, isn't it?" she said softly. "Why?" Crisp narrowed his eyes. "You've been pulling the strings all along. You're the one who tipped us off about Lacey. You're the one who stole the evidence. And now, you're playing with us, trying to control the narrative. But why? What's your endgame?" Riley's gaze flickered toward the door, as if making sure no one else was around. Then she turned back to them, her expression softening, almost pitying. "You think it's about money, don't you?" she said. "Or power. Maybe even revenge. That's what you've been chasing all along. But you're wrong. It's never been about any of that." Crisp felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just a confession. It was something deeper, something that made him uncomfortable. "What is it about, then?" Crisp asked, his voice low but steady. Riley stepped closer, the smile gone now, replaced with something colder, more calculating. "It's about control," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's about making people believe they're in charge when they're not. It's about watching them struggle, pushing them to their limits, seeing how far they'll go, and in the end, it's about proving that I am the one pulling the strings." Crisp and Whimsy exchanged a look, both of them grasping the magnitude of what she was saying. But the true depth of Riley's motivation was still elusive, hidden beneath the surface. "You're playing some kind of game," Whimsy said, his voice rising in disbelief. "But why? What do you gain from all of this? Lacey's dead. Eleanor's still missing. You've destroyed everything." Riley's eyes glinted with something almost manic now, a gleam of something dark and twisted that Crisp hadn't seen before. "That's the point, Mr. Whimsy," she said, her voice rising, tinged with excitement. "I didn't destroy everything. I made everything. I crafted it all." She paused, as if savoring the moment, the tension thickening in the air. "You see," she continued, her voice now a soft, unsettling murmur. "I've been watching you, watching all of you. You think you're solving a crime, but no, this is no crime. This is an experiment, a test, to see how you react, how far you'll go to uncover the truth. But the truth isn't what you think it is." Crisp's mind whirred. An experiment. The idea seemed ludicrous, but as she spoke, he began to understand. This was never about the people involved. This wasn't about Eleanor or Lacey. This was about Riley herself, about her need to manipulate, to control, to see how much she could push people before they snapped. "What kind of sick game is this?" Whimsy muttered. Riley's lips curled into a cruel smile, the kind of game where the pieces are always in play, where everyone's a pawn, and I'm the one moving them. You think you're the hunters, but you're the prey. Crisp stepped forward, his fists clenched, but he kept his voice steady. Why? Why do this? Why go to such extremes? Riley's smile faded, and for the first time, something like regret flickered in her eyes. Because I was never seen, she said softly. I spent my entire life in the background, a shadow. I was always overlooked, always ignored. I watched others rise to the top while I stayed hidden. But now, I'm in control. I've orchestrated everything, and no one can stop me. The chilling truth hit Crisp with a sharp intensity. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about power in the traditional sense. It was about recognition, about Riley's desperate need to be seen, to be acknowledged as something more than just a technician in a lab. She had been pulling the strings, playing with their minds, just to feel in control of something, anything. She had turned the entire investigation into her personal stage, manipulating every moment for her own satisfaction. Every lie, every death, every stolen piece of evidence, it had all been a means to an end. She wasn't just hiding behind the shadows. She was creating them. But all of this, Crisp said, his voice hard, this manipulation, the deaths, it's madness. It won't stop until someone pays the price. Riley's expression twisted into something darker, more final. That's the beauty of it. There's no end. It's perpetual. The game goes on, Inspector. Whether you stop me now or not, I'll always be 2 steps ahead, because I control the pieces. Crisp's thoughts were clearer now. The weight of her twisted psychology settled in his chest like lead. Riley wasn't just a criminal. She was a puppet master, a dangerous mind who had manipulated everyone around her for so long that she believed she was invincible. She had played them all like fools, making them think they were chasing a simple case, when in reality, they had been chasing her the whole time. We're done here, Crisp said, his voice cold. He turned to Whimsy, a hard edge to his tone. Call for backup. We need to take her into custody. But as Riley's gaze shifted toward the door, Crisp felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up again. She wasn't done yet. There was one final twist to this game, a twist that was only just beginning to reveal itself. The tension in the lab was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything they had uncovered. Riley's twisted confession lingered in the air, her cruel smile etched into Crisp's mind as he stood, motionless, weighing the best way forward. She had made it clear that she was in control, that she thought herself untouchable. But now, something had shifted in the balance. Riley had underestimated him. Crisp was calm, but every nerve in his body was alive with purpose. The investigation had come full circle, and now it was time for the final move. We have to act now, Whimsy said quietly, his voice edged with urgency. She's already shown us how far she's willing to go. We can't give her any more. Time to play games. Crisp nodded without a word, his gaze fixed on Riley. She still stood there, her posture relaxed, as if she hadn't a care in the world. But Crisp could see it in her eyes. Her confidence was starting to crack, just the slightest hint of unease flickering beneath the surface. For the first time in the entire case, Riley wasn't in control. Don't be too sure of yourself, Crisp said, his voice steady, almost calm. He was closing in on her, and she knew it. The game's over, Riley. You've been manipulating us from the start. But now you've made one mistake underestimating how far we'd go to stop you. Her smile faltered for the briefest of moments, and that was all Crisp needed. The mask was slipping. No, Riley said slowly, shaking her head, her voice full of mockery. You think you've won, but you haven't. You don't even know what you're up against. Whimsy stepped closer, his expression grim. I think we've learned enough. The evidence is clear, Riley. We've seen through your game. For a second, Riley's eyes flickered to the door again, a subtle glance that Crisp caught. It was the tiniest of movements, but it told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't just giving up. She was looking for a way out, planning an escape. Crisp's heart quickened. He had to act quickly. She wasn't going to let this end without a fight. Before she could make her move, Crisp stepped forward, his voice a controlled command. You've been orchestrating this entire thing, Riley. You've used every person around you as a tool. The murders, the disappearances, they were just means to an end. And now it's time to end the game, or for a moment, Riley just stood there, looking at him with an unreadable expression. Then she laughed, a cold, unsettling sound that echoed through the room. You think you can stop me? She scoffed. You think you're in control. You have no idea what I've planned. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Crisp saw a flicker of desperation behind the bravado. It was subtle, but it was there. We know everything we need to know, Whimsy said, his voice darkening. The truth has already come to light. You were the one behind Lacey's murder. You were the one feeding us false information. And now, your game is over. Riley's gaze hardened, but the smile returned to her face, though it was tinged with something darker now. She wasn't backing down. Instead, it seemed like she was bracing for something. You're wrong, Mr. Whimsy, she said, her voice calm once more, almost a calm. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Crisp watched her closely, every instinct telling him she was preparing to make her final move. He knew he had to keep her talking, keep her focused on him. He couldn't afford to let her get away. I think you've misunderstood, Riley, Crisp said, his tone shifting slightly. You're not the one in control anymore. You're not the one calling the shots. You're cornered. And now you have to answer for everything. But Riley wasn't finished yet. Her hand, which had been loosely hanging by her side, suddenly shifted. There was a slight movement, a barely perceptible shift in her body. Crisp's eyes locked on her, a split second before she reached for something hidden beneath her lab coat. In that moment, everything snapped into focus. Whimsy shouted, "Look out!" just as Riley pulled something from beneath her coat. It was a small, gleaming object, a knife, slick with a polished edge. The room erupted into chaos. Crisp reacted instinctively, his body moving before his mind could fully catch up. He lunged forward, grabbing Riley's wrist just as the blade came slashing toward him. The force of the movement spun her off balance, and the knife went skittering across the floor, clattering away from her. Whimsy was already there, moving to intercept her, but Riley wasn't finished yet. She twisted in Crisp's grip, her eyes wild with fear and fury. She was fighting, desperate to break free, her movements erratic. You think you've won? You think you've figured it out? Riley spat, her breath coming in jagged gasps. You have no idea what's at stake. I won't let you take it all away from me. But Crisp was unrelenting. With a quick motion, he disarmed her completely, forcing her to the ground with his knee pressing into her back. The fight went out of her instantly, and the air in the room seemed to go still. Riley, Crisp said, his voice a low, controlled warning. You've gone too far. You've hurt too many people. It's over. She struggled beneath him, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed, replaced now by the cold realization that she had lost. Her breath was ragged, her pulse pounding in her throat. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, it can't be over. You don't understand. You don't know why I did it. Crisp's grip tightened, his voice steady as he leaned down, bringing his face close to hers. Tell me why, Riley. Tell me why you did this. For a moment, there was silence. Her eyes locked with his, and Crisp could almost feel the weight of everything she had been hiding, everything she had buried beneath layers of lies. I wanted control, she said softly, her voice breaking, barely a whisper. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to make them pay, make you pay for never noticing me. The words hung in the air, jagged and raw. It wasn't about money or revenge, but something far more devastating. Riley's desperate need to be recognized, to feel like she mattered, to be in control of something in her life, and she had been willing to destroy everything to achieve it. Crisp exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her confession settle on him like a shroud. It was a motive driven by something deeper than simple malice. It was the shattered psyche of someone who had never felt seen, never felt important, and had gone to horrific lengths to force others to notice her. But in the end, it was too late. Riley had made her final move, and now there was no way out. The game was over. Take her away, Crisp said, standing slowly. His voice was calm, but his mind was still processing everything he had just heard. He had solved the case, but the true horror of it, the hidden motive, the lengths Riley had gone to, was still echoing in his mind. Whimsy nodded, his expression somber as he helped Riley to her feet. Handcuffing her with a practiced ease, Crisp watched them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the case being over, something inside him had changed. The final confrontation had been won, but the unsettling truth about the villain's motivations would linger unanswered for a long time. And in the back of his mind, one question still echoed. What other games were still left to play? The cold air outside the lab felt oddly refreshing, as if the world were slowly exhaling after the chaos of the past few days. Crisp and Whimsy stood side by side, watching the police take Riley away in a black van, her face still locked in a grimace of defeat, but with something else flickering behind her eyes, something almost resigned. As the van pulled out of the lot, the weight of the case finally seemed to lift off Crisp's shoulders. The conclusion of this twisted game nearly in reach. He'd solved the puzzle. He'd caught the killer, but there was something that still gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Riley's confession had been too clean, too perfect. There had been no hesitation in her voice when she'd spoken, no remorse, just cold clarity. She'd manipulated them all, sure, but had she been the true mastermind? "You okay?" Whimsy asked, glancing at him, sensing the unease in his posture. "I should be," Crisp muttered, "but I'm not." "You're thinking about what she said," Whimsy replied knowingly. Crisp nodded, but it wasn't just Riley's words that troubled him. It was the pattern, the subtle shifts in her story, the way she'd played them, how everything had unfolded just the way she wanted. It all fit too well, too neatly. Whimsy gave a long sigh, his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. "You did what you had to do. It's over now, is it?" Crisp asked, his voice more a question than a statement. Riley was in control. She made the moves, but I've been thinking. She was too ready, too willing to confess. No one behaves that way unless they have a reason to. A person like that, one who controls a situation like she did, doesn't let go of power that easily. She wanted us to catch her. She wanted us to believe the whole thing was over. Whimsy frowned. "You think there's more to it?" "I don't know," Crisp said slowly, his mind still churning. "But something's been bothering me. I need to go back. There's one more thing I have to check." They drove in silence back to the station. As the hours passed, the weight of the case seemed to settle back in, even heavier than before. Crisp sat in his office, staring at the files in front of him, his fingers tracing the edge of one particular photograph, a picture of Riley, smiling for the camera, so unassuming, so ordinary. She had pulled it off flawlessly. But why? His gaze shifted to the stack of evidence on his desk. There had to be something he was missing. It was then that something caught his eye: an envelope, hidden beneath a folder, tucked away almost too carefully. It hadn't been there earlier. He pulled it out, his pulse quickening as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, stained with faint smudges of ink. "Check the files in the storage room. You missed something important." His heart skipped. He'd seen that handwriting before. No. Crisp muttered to himself, the realization dawning on him. He had missed something. Someone had planted this, hoping he would come back for it. The real game was still in play. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and rushed toward the storage room. The place was dimly lit, cold, the floor creaking underfoot as he moved between rows of filing cabinets. It felt like stepping into a tomb, silent, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were watching him. He stopped in front of the cabinet labeled "Case Files, Eleanor Riley." There it was, his earlier oversight. Opening the drawer, he pulled out the file he had thought was complete. But as his fingers brushed the edge of the folder, he noticed something off: an extra sheet of paper tucked behind the final page. Crisp's hands shook slightly as he removed it and read the note. "You think you've found the truth, but it's only half the story. Go back, look closer, don't forget the shadows." The words burned into his mind, and a terrible clarity dawned. He wasn't supposed to have found this. Riley had set it up. The entire investigation had been leading him back here, to this point. The shadows. Crisp turned to leave, but as he reached the door, someone moved in his peripheral vision. His pulse raced as he spun. his mind working frantically to process what was happening. He didn't expect to see anyone in the storage room at this hour. Looking for something, Inspector. The voice was calm, almost amused. It was Riley. Crisp's heart pounded in his chest. She was supposed to be in custody, on her way to prison. But here she was, standing in the doorway, as if she had never been taken. Why you? Crisp started, but Riley raised a hand to silence him. I told you. Inspector, she said softly, you don't understand yet. You thought I was the puppet master, but that's only part of it. I've been playing a role, but not the one you think. The words hit Crisp like a cold slap. His mind raced as the realization began to settle in. Riley had never been the mastermind. She had been playing her own part in someone else's game. Who else is involved? He demanded, his voice tight with disbelief. Riley's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was something darker, something more unsettling. You've been chasing shadows, Crisp, she said, but now you're about to meet the real players. Before he could respond, Riley stepped aside, revealing a figure standing just behind her in the dim light. Meet my partner, Riley said, her voice dropping into a tone of finality. I think you'll find this much more interesting than you ever expected. The figure stepped forward into the light, and Crisp froze. Standing before him was someone he had least expected, the last person he had ever imagined could be involved. It was Whimsy. Whimsy? Crisp whispered, his breath catching in his throat. Whimsy's expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and distant. I'm afraid, Crisp, he said softly, that this game isn't over yet. Crisp's world tilted. The final revelation hit him with the force of a blow. Whimsy, his trusted partner, the one who had been by his side through it all, was part of this elaborate scheme. He was the true mastermind. Everything fell into place then. The subtle clues, the misdirections, the careful nudges Riley had made to steer the investigation. It had all been designed to lead him in circles. And Whimsy, he had been the one pulling the strings all along. The trap had been set, and Crisp had walked right into it. Crisp's mind was reeling, his vision blurred as the weight of the realization crashed down on him. Whimsy, the man who had been his trusted partner, who had been by his side through every step of the case, was the true architect behind this whole twisted game. You've got to be kidding me, Crisp muttered, disbelief thick in his voice. The world around him seemed to narrow, the air heavy, suffocating. As he processed the enormity of what was happening, he had been played, misled, all this time. Every twist, every turn, every false lead, all of it had been set in motion by Whimsy. And now, standing before him, Whimsy's cold eyes revealed no sign of guilt, no remorse, only a calculated calmness that made Crisp's blood run cold. So this is it then? Crisp finally managed to speak, his voice strained but composed. Despite the chaos in his mind, this whole thing, it was you, from the start. Whimsy's lips curled into a small, almost pitying smile. You were always one step behind, Crisp. You were too focused on Riley, on the obvious game, to see the real mastermind lurking in plain sight. Crisp took a step back, the shock fading into a surge of cold anger. All this time, I never suspected you. You were pulling the strings. But why? Why frame Riley? Why involve yourself in all of this? Whimsy's gaze hardened. Because Riley wasn't important. She was a tool, a convenient distraction for you, so you wouldn't see what was really going on. The murders, the stolen evidence, everything. They were all part of a much bigger picture, a picture you were never meant to understand. A sickening realization bloomed in Crisp's chest, and the pieces began to fall into place. It hadn't been about power or money. Whimsy had used Riley as a smokescreen, keeping him focused on the wrong person. The truth, the one thing Crisp had overlooked, had always been right there in front of him. It was never just about Riley, Whimsy continued, his tone growing colder, more detached. It was about control, the kind of control I've never had before, over the investigation, over you. Crisp's fists clenched as his mind scrambled to keep up. So you set me up, you wanted to play me. But why? You're a part of this, Whimsy. You're complicit in everything. The murders, the lies, the manipulation. How did you get away with it? Whimsy took a step closer, his posture almost casual. You didn't see it, did you? The way I stayed just behind the scenes, never too far from the action. I played the role of the trusted partner, the one you would never suspect. It was perfect. Crisp's gaze flicked to Riley, still standing in the corner, her expression unreadable. Her role had been a decoy, a pawn in Whimsy's game. But what was his ultimate goal? And why hadn't anyone figured it out? Why hadn't he, you think? This is over, don't you? Whimsy's voice broke through Crisp's thoughts, his eyes glinting with something almost predatory. But I'm not finished yet. Neither of us is. This isn't just about the people involved. This is about the message I've been sending, the game I've been playing all along. You're delusional, Crisp snapped, stepping forward. Now fully aware of the danger. You've gone too far. You'll never get away with it. Whimsy's smile deepened, his eyes narrowing. Don't be so sure, Crisp. You've been played. Just like Riley was. It's always been about who controls the narrative, who controls the story. And right now, I'm the one telling it. Before Crisp could react, Whimsy's hand shot out, grabbing a small device from his coat pocket. A faint beep echoed through the room as a red light blinked on the device. What's that? Crisp demanded, his pulse quickening. Whimsy's smile turned into something darker, more sinister. A little insurance policy, he said softly, in case things didn't go as planned. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The realization hit Crisp like a ton of bricks. A bomb. Whimsy had set up a bomb. A failsafe to prevent anyone from ever exposing the truth. It wasn't just about control over the investigation anymore. It was about making sure he could never be touched. Whimsy, don't do this, Crisp said, his voice low but urgent. You're making a mistake. You've already lost. You've been caught. Whimsy's fingers danced over the device as he laughed, the sound low and mocking. Caught? No, you just don't get it, Crisp. You've never been in control of this. You never even knew what was really happening. I was never after you. I was after the system, the way things work. And you, Inspector, were just another pawn. In my game. Crisp's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But everything was slipping through his fingers. His gaze darted to Riley, who had been silent through the exchange. Was she still part of Whimsy's game? Or had she been a mere bystander, caught in a trap of her own making? The seconds felt like hours. Crisp's chest tightened as the weight of the situation pressed in. He needed to act quickly, but the device in Whimsy's hands left no room for error. One wrong move, and everything would be over. Then, as if reading his mind, Riley stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. Whimsy, stop. It's over. You don't have to do this. For a moment, Whimsy hesitated, his fingers hovering over the device. A flicker of doubt passed through his eyes, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade. Riley, he muttered, almost as if in disbelief. You're still here. You're still playing the part. Riley's eyes hardened. I'm not playing anything anymore, Whimsy. You've already lost. There was a brief silence, a heartbeat of hesitation, before Whimsy's expression twisted in rage. No, you don't get to decide this. I'm in control here. Before he could make another move, Crisp lunged forward, seizing the device from Whimsy's hand in a swift motion. In that instant, the room seemed to explode into chaos. Shouts, the sound of rushing footsteps, the cracking of a nearby window. But Crisp didn't hesitate. He crushed the device with his boot, rendering it useless. The fight wasn't over yet, but this time, it was Crisp who was in control. As Whimsy collapsed to the ground in defeat, Riley stepped back, her face unreadable. Crisp's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at her, the complexity of the situation still settling in. The final twist had revealed the truth, but it also revealed just how deeply the web of lies had been woven. Whimsy was taken away, his cold eyes locked on Crisp, with something almost resembling a final challenge. But this was the end of the game. Justice had been served, at least for now. Yet, as Crisp stood there, watching the chaos unfold around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't quite over. There were always shadows, always a new layer to uncover. He had won the battle, but the war, that, it seemed, would never truly end. The weight of the case seemed to lift from Crisp's shoulders as he watched Whimsy led away, the handcuffs biting into his former partner's wrists. But as the scene unfolded, Something in Crisp's gut churned uneasily. The sense of finality everyone else seemed to feel didn't quite match the quiet unease that lingered in his mind. "It's over now, right?" Whimsy's voice echoed back. To Crisp, his cold words haunting the air even after he'd been ushered away. They left a subtle residue of doubt, an unsettling feeling that Crisp couldn't shake. Riley, standing off to the side, was quiet, almost too quiet. The police had already taken her into custody, but there was no victory in her posture, no triumph in the way she held herself. She had played her part, but now she was nothing more than a pawn in a game that no longer made sense to her, just as it didn't to Crisp. He watched as the officers bundled her into a car, her face a mask of tired indifference. Something in the way she looked at him made his stomach twist, a silent acknowledgement of the truth they'd both uncovered. But she wasn't the one he should have been worried about. Not anymore. Turning away from the scene, Crisp walked toward the car that would take him back to his office. The city was quiet tonight, the streets empty except for a few cars and the distant hum of traffic. It should have been peaceful, but the unease gnawed at him. There were too many lingering questions, too many shadows still hiding in the corners. He leaned back in his seat, staring out of the window. The words Whimsy had spoken earlier echoed in his mind, almost taunting him. "You've never been in control of this." A part of him wanted to believe that now it was over. The case had been solved, the criminal mastermind had been caught, the puzzle pieced together. But Crisp's instincts told him otherwise. There was still something hidden, something just out of reach. It wasn't enough for the pieces to fit. It had to make sense, and there were gaps in the story that didn't add up. He sighed and closed his eyes, letting the soft thrum of the engine lull him into a brief moment of relaxation. Just as he began to convince himself that it was truly over, his phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the moment of calm with a sense of foreboding. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The name displayed was one he hadn't expected to see. It was from Lacey's sister, the woman who had been at the center of it all, the woman who had lost so much, a woman who seemed to have vanished from the investigation as quickly as she had appeared. The message was short, almost too casual for the context. "You missed something. You'll find it soon enough." Crisp's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the words. He read them again, then again, his fingers trembling slightly as he gripped the phone. What was she trying to tell him? He didn't understand. Not yet. But deep down, Crisp knew there was one more piece to this puzzle. One more shadow lurking in the background. One more unanswered question, waiting for him. His mind spun. It didn't make sense. How could it be possible? Riley had confessed. Whimsy had been exposed. They had solved the case. Or had they? Crisp leaned forward, the car's soft hum fading into the background as he focused on the task at hand. Lacey's sister had been the one to give him the final push. The cryptic message that seemed so innocuous but, in reality, was everything. It was a reminder, just like the case had done before, that nothing was ever truly finished. The finality, the sense of resolution that others seemed to feel, it wasn't there for him. Not yet. There was still something else, something he had missed, something he had overlooked. Lacey's sister knew it. Crisp's fingers twitched over the phone as he mulled over the possibilities. Had he really pieced together everything from the beginning? Had he been too focused on Riley, too sure that she was the central player in this twisted game? Or had he simply been too eager to close the case? A few moments later, the car pulled up to his office. He stepped out, his mind still reeling from the message. The world outside felt eerily silent, the city's usual pulse now muted by his own thoughts. His office door creaked as he pushed it open, but he didn't bother turning on the lights. He didn't need them. He knew the space well enough now, the clutter of paperwork, the files stacked high in the corner cases that had come and gone, mysteries solved and others left unfinished. But tonight, it wasn't the usual pile of files that drew his attention. The desk was cluttered, but there was something different now. A fresh stack of paper, neatly arranged in front of him. Crisp frowned, walking over to it, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had just solved one puzzle, but the feeling wasn't the same. There was something off about this new stack. A deliberate placement, the handwriting on the top sheet, a name he recognized instantly, Lacey's sister. He hadn't expected this, not now, not after everything that had already happened. The moment his eyes fell on the words, his heart froze. The name written on the top sheet wasn't Lacey's sister's name at all. It was a name he hadn't seen in years, a name buried deep within the case files, a name linked to the very beginning of everything. It was a name tied to a case he thought was long buried, one that had been dismissed, one that had seemed like a simple accident. But now, looking at it again, Crisp knew the truth. It had never been an accident, and the person behind it all hadn't just been playing a game they had been waiting. The case was far from over. It was only just beginning.